Okay, I don't know if that's still working for you.
Nothing has changed on our
Okay,
end. So yeah.
all right, I
Okay.
think that's fine then. So sorry about technical issues here. So I want to start with this paradox. I think it really helps illustrate what I'm going to be talking about today, which is the pit latrine paradox. So Gwenzi et al. Talk about this in terms of the pit latrine is both really important for sanitation, critical for protecting human health. And this is a form of sanitation that's one of the most common forms of sanitation around the world. On the other side, pit latrines can also become pollution and health risk hotspots. So essentially, they become catch-all receptacles for different household wastes, including different types of medical waste, biohazardous waste, pesticides, and menstrual hygiene waste, which is what I'm going to be focusing on today, as well as other forms of hazardous waste. So you can see that these challenges kind of coexist. So the presentation today is going to talk, I'm going to talk more about these challenges, then focus on experiences from sanitation workers. So often this issue is addressed more from the side of menstrual health and hygiene and product users. I'm going to talk more about the other side of the issue. And then I'm going to end by talking about how we can respond to some of these challenges with different types of participatory approaches to kind of bring more attention to unheard voices amongst these challenges. So yeah, so part one, what is the challenge that we're talking about today? So you can see different types of waste here. This is all coming from pit latrines and sorted out from fecal sludge in the picture. So it's actually really two challenges. And so the first one is about addressing menstrual health needs. So menstrual health and hygiene, which is often known as MHH, is really central to human well-being and dignity. And this includes a number of things. It's quite a holistic definition for MHH. And one of the things it includes is having access to adequate menstrual products to manage menstruation, as well as adequate sanitation facilities. And with this topic, often what comes up is like, oh, there's lots of reusable products. Why isn't this going to solve the problem? But it's important to remember that in many cases, disposable menstrual products are increasingly preferred. So in low-income contexts, and particularly rural areas, cloths have been used, and then this involves washing the cloths and drying the cloths and reusing them. So disposable pads can be seen as more modern and more hygienic, perhaps. They don't require washing and drying and hanging up. And also some of these reusable products have limited market access, so people can't really necessarily get access to buy them, or they're perhaps too expensive. So overall, this challenge is really about ensuring that people get the access to the products that they want, and also that they have adequate sanitation facilities to change those products and have soap and water. So the second challenge connected to this is that growing increase in the use of menstrual products then creates another challenge, a waste challenge. So using disposable menstrual pads is a growing issue because they contain mostly plastic. So they're kind of like absorbent materials as well as plastic, largely plastic. Someone can expect to use about 10,000 products over their lifetime. And we use this term complicated plastics to talk about this kind of waste issue because these products contain plastics and absorbent material, kind of hard to deal with mixed together. But they're also, this kind of waste is also stigmatized and hard to manage for that reason. But also these products are really necessary for human dignity and health. So they're not like a plastic bag where, you know, it could just be replaced with another type of product necessarily. It's much harder to replace. So we really can't necessarily remove it from our waste streams. And because of the growing use of these products, the volume of this waste is expected to grow. I think I heard someone call it a sanitary time bomb, in that there is more and more use of disposable products, and then the waste part is not necessarily addressed. So one example would be in the Kenyan context, where there has been a real push for providing these products free in schools. And this is really important to meet menstrual health needs. But at the same time, there hasn't been so much attention to the waste issue. Many of these initiatives are coming from, for example, actually the education ministry or maybe from public health. And so they're really focusing on improving the MHH aspect of this problem. But in many low-income contexts, there are limited disposal options. So solid waste services are not necessarily available, especially in informal settlements where there's just not good waste removal services. So in many cases, people using these products don't have good disposal options. They need to dispose of them outside of kind of formal collection systems. And on top of that, there are ongoing gender taboos with menstruation and with these waste products also. That means that they're stigmatized and that people are often trying to hide this waste in some way. So this often involves burning, burying menstrual pads, disposing of them in informal dump sites, drains, rivers, really any kind of location in the neighborhood. Also into sanitation systems, so often into pit latrines. And in the case that I'm going to be presenting today in Kisumu, we had access to some baseline data before we started our research, and that showed about 90% or more percent of people who responded to the survey threw their menstrual pads into their pit latrines. So essentially that is like the main way of dealing with that problem in the case that I'm presenting today. But you can see that there are, in different situations, there are different methods of dealing with this waste outside of the formal collection system. So that brings me to the problem for our research on complicated plastics, which is that there has been a lot of attention to challenge one in terms of research work, which is great and really important. A lot of it has actually come from advocacy organizations, who have made important steps forward. The JMP has developed menstrual health indicators in recent years. So there's a lot of progress being made on the first challenge. It's still, an important issue to address, but there's progress being made, whereas there hasn't been quite as much attention onto this challenge too. So that, as I mentioned, there are taboos that stigmatize menstrual waste. This means it's actually not just a challenge for the user, but also to get policymakers engaged with this issue has also sometimes been challenging. So there's limited frameworks for actually what to do with menstrual waste in terms of the policy side. And kind of outside the scope of the presentation today, I just want to mention we've been looking at those policies to see where does this issue come up? How should we be dealing with this problem? And there's been a lot of development in menstrual health policies over the last few decades, maybe the last decade or so. They've been really popping up even in the last 5 years. Many countries are starting to develop policies for menstrual health. And there are also sanitation policies, and there are also solid waste policies. What we can see is that the issue of menstrual waste is kind of falling between these different types of policies. So, there's menstrual health side and the access part, and then sanitation is kind of dealing with fecal sludge, but not the solid waste part because they don't see that as part of their kind of responsibility. So it's an issue that hasn't got that much attention on the policy side. So that then means that individuals are kind of coming up with their own approach to deal with the problem. Something that is fairly common is the use of incinerators. So those are promoted often for schools as a solution to deal with menstrual waste at schools. That then brings up a whole range of other sustainability issues around incineration and emissions that are produced that way. But it's kind of seen as a clean way of just getting rid of the problem. There's been little attention actually to the side of this problem in terms of sanitation workers and how they are dealing with this challenge and experiencing this challenge. And this is important because when people throw menstrual pads into pit latrines, they get blocked up faster. They are much harder to empty, so you can't necessarily use mechanical sort of suction machines to empty the pit latrines when they're blocked up with solid waste. which then makes the work for sanitation workers who are emptying those pits much, much harder and also less safe. So you can see that this sort of challenge 1 and 2 are in tension somehow, because we're trying to improve menstrual health and access to products, but then also dealing with this waste issue that then creates other risks, particularly for workers. So that's what I'm going to talk about here in part 2, experiences from sanitation workers. So just to mention that in this research, we have drawn on different theoretical perspectives, including work on discard studies. So this looks at how risks are produced, not just in terms of like which pathogens are there in fecal sludge, but also how are these risks socially produced? So where is the stigma coming from, for example? And also embodiment theory, looking at how these risks, both this biological, social risks, are experienced by the sanitation workers, how they're kind of taken up into the body and experienced over time. So the case study I'm going to be presenting about today focuses on Kisumu in Kenya. So actually one reason for the choice of this case study was that we were actually originally focusing on Nairobi with the emphasis on informal settlements, but there was a large USAID project on called the Western Kenya Sanitation Project that actually included some modules or components on menstrual waste. So we thought this would be a really great opportunity to kind of do some work where there's already a lot of synergies and attention from stakeholders on this issue. So that was the reason for the choice. Unfortunately, the project got defunded kind of before this work ended, but there's still some ongoing work on this topic anyways, that kind of is a legacy of that project. So we did, in terms of what I'm presenting today, we did a survey with sanitation workers. We also did some interviews, as well as some participatory methods, including mapping exercises. So just a few more points about Kisumu. It is the 3rd largest city in Kenya. It's located on the lake. Most people don't have access to solid waste services. So most households are handling that by dumping their waste in public locations or burning it or composting it. And in terms of dumping waste, so people don't necessarily want to dump menstrual waste in public locations. So that's another reason that it is often thrown in pit latrines. And we found that in this case, sanitation community organizations, so sort of like sanitation promoters, advised people to throw their menstrual waste in the pit latrines. That was kind of like the suggested way to deal with that waste, because without any kind of other option, this was the best way of dealing with it. There has been a lot of attention to solid waste in Kisumu, like kind of dealing with garbage. And that's another reason that kind of putting the menstrual pads in pit latrines kind of solves that problem. And one of those recent changes is that they established a new dump site way further out of the city. So instead of using like the central city dump site, it's been moved way out, which is a point I'll come back to later. So just to give you a bit of a picture of how the waste from pit latrines is handled, there are some different options in Kisumu. They have a sort of sewage treatment plant, but they also have this wastewater lagoon. And this is where waste from septic tanks and pit latrines is generally taken and emptied out. The problem is that the sanitation workers are not really allowed to dump fecal sludge that contains solid waste at this lagoon because it contaminates the lagoon and causes other problems. So it's kind of like a gray area in terms of what's allowed, but depending on the situation, some of the workers are able to bring the waste that they empty and kind of strain it out. As you can see here, this sort of system here to stop the solid waste from getting through into the lagoon, and then they have to kind of scoop it out and let it dry and then deal with it later. So this is kind of how it is dealt with at the moment. So now I want to give you just some of the experiences from the sanitation workers, starting with the survey results. So just to give you, I don't know if I can use like a laser here. Okay. This is working. Okay, so just to give you an overview of who these workers actually are. So most of the workers are between 26 to 45 years. You can see most of them are men. There are a few women sanitation workers though. Also, most of them are self-employed. You can see here that, so I think we had around 120 respondents, if I remember right. So most are self-employed, which means they're paid per pit, which is interesting and relevant because if the pit is very hard to empty because of all the solid waste, it's just going to take them longer. They're still getting paid like a flat fee for emptying it. Some of the workers do have salaries, or they're working for an organization, which means they're a little bit more secure. In terms of the type of sanitation work, so the people are involved with different types of sanitation work, and they could report multiple things. But you can see most of the workers here are doing manual emptying. This means they're emptying the pit latrines by hand, essentially. Then we asked about where the fecal sludge gets taken when it's emptied out of the pit latrines, to understand this kind of flow of waste and what happens to it. So most of the respondents say that it's taken to the lagoon that I just showed you. You can see that there's quite a large number that also say that the waste is buried in a nearby pit. So this could be like just nearby the actual pit latrine, and just make a hole and bury the waste so that the toilet can be used again. And there's a few other responses like being washed into the lake and so on. How often do you have to deal with waste that contains menstrual pads in your sanitation work? So you can see the response here is basically all the time. So 63% say always and 30% say often. So this is an issue that sanitation workers are dealing with really all the time as part of their daily work. So what percentage is actually, it's really my light, of the solid waste that is emptied out, what percentage is menstrual waste? Like how much? It could be other things as well. So we can see that the majority of respondents are saying, or 40% are saying that it's most, and then 35 say half. So we can see like a large portion of the solid waste is menstrual waste. This is important because it means in terms of solving the problem of solid waste that creates emptying issues, menstrual pads are like a clear issue that need to be addressed. And then in terms of how often this causes problems for equipment, we can see about 24% say always and 28% say often. So for a large chunk of the workers, this is creating problems in terms of equipment. And this means essentially that they need to use kind of more manual ways of emptying out this waste, kind of like forks and different types of manual scooping to get the solid waste out, when otherwise they might be able to use some kind of more mechanical suction tools. Another finding is that this is a growing problem. So we kind of know that in general from the perspective of the pads being given out. We can see the workers are also saying that this is a trend that is increasing. So here we asked, what has been the change over time since you started doing this sanitation work? And so 68% of the respondents say that there is more menstrual waste today than when I started doing this job. So there is a general trend. This is a growing waste problem. And then this question, it's not highlighted in brown here, but the last on this slide says that, are you aware of any environmentally friendly menstrual products? So we're just kind of interested in whether these are getting more attention amongst the workers, and it's kind of like about almost 50-50 that some have heard of these products and some haven't. So in terms of why this is a challenge, so first of all, it requires some kind of separation and sorting. Like I showed you with the lagoon, the workers need to kind of separate this waste out. So creating an extra challenge for them, and sometimes they're not allowed to bring in the solid waste. It takes longer to empty a pit. This is kind of one of the biggest problems. It's additional steps and challenges to do that. You can see this fork here that's kind of being used to pull out some of those pads and other stuff that's stuck in the pit. It can also be like traditional cloths as well. Of course, it's not just the plastic pads, but those at least can sort of degrade. So it makes the job heavier to do. It breaks equipment sometimes because the equipment is really just designed for dealing with fecal sludge. It's stigmatizing to manage. So menstrual waste is basically seen by the workers as more stigmatizing than just handling fecal sludge. And then they often report using more chemicals during the emptying process than normal. So there are a range of different health risks that doing this emptying involves. So of course, emptying pit latrines in general is dangerous. And it becomes more dangerous kind of the more it is done by hand. And then, of course, if people don't have adequate protective equipment. We saw in this case that most workers did report using gloves and boots, for example, not necessarily masks, but at least gloves and boots and overalls. But the more that they have to empty this solid waste out, the harder it becomes, the more they have to kind of get hands-on, and the more that they're exposed to a number of different physical health impacts, like different risks of infection. So this is one of the most commonly reported. Impact was gastrointestinal infections. About 68 people responded. Another risk is dealing with all of this kind of material in the toilet. So cuts, lacerations from material inside the pit was an issue. The photo I just showed was from emptying that was being done. And in that case, the pit latrine actually had to be kind of like jackhammered open. The cement was they couldn't really empty it without breaking the concrete slab, essentially. So it's can be really dangerous, with risks also of like the pit latrine collapsing and all these different kinds of physical health risks. We also heard nausea and headaches from the toxic gases, skin irritation as well from different cleaning products. And in this particular case, Kasumu can be very, very hot. So wearing protective equipment can make the work and it's very physical work. So people also reported heat stress, dehydration, fainting, and those kind of impacts. Some respondents also say they have experienced no health impacts as well. So then it's not just the physical health impacts, there's also psychosocial impacts that people experience in different ways. So some of these include worrying about the fact just not having regular income, because they're kind of emptying on a ad hoc basis, essentially when a landlord calls them to say the pit's full and empty it. There is anxiety from the risk of being fined or arrested. So some of the workers have a kind of registration and sort of they are allowed to empty pits, whereas others are sort of unregistered and doing this kind of, or they're known as shadow workers. So they're not registered sanitation workers. They haven't done like training and sort of being approved to do pit emptying. So technically they can be fined or arrested for being unregistered. So that's another kind of stress for some of the workers. It's also very stressful in terms of different things that they pull out of the pits, given that things are just thrown in there. And also a really big one is feeling ostracized and feeling the stigma from the community and also, local governments for doing a, quote, dirty job. Some workers also report no psychosocial types of impacts from this work. And I just wanted to mention something on the gendered aspects of this work. So there are not that many women who are doing sanitation work, but actually the number has been growing. We can see the people who've been kind of that women have started doing this work in the last 5 years or so. So it's kind of like growing as an employment opportunity. But here we can look at who is doing this work during the day or during the night. So at night, this is kind of like when the shadow workers are working. And emptying at night, so it's most likely people who are, they're not registered. They are then working without probably proper equipment, without proper training or safety equipment. It's hard to see, so there's more risk of injury and accidents. So it is more dangerous to be doing this work at night, aside from the fact that you can also be fined for it. So you can see it's mostly men who are doing this, or all men, in fact, who are doing this work at night and who are kind of these shadow workers here. And we can also see that for the women workers, almost all of them report being registered here, whereas for the men, it's actually more of them are actually unregistered, and so face these greater risks. And here's just some of the findings from the qualitative work. So experiences from these workers. So first of all, I just want to mention there are a lot of negative experiences that the workers report. However, some of them do think that it is a good job and that they're earning an income, but at the same time that what bothers them is that how people perceive them. So people stigmatize me and think I'm stupid, yet I'm earning an income from what I'm doing and I like it. Others are kind of very stressed about the work. For example, the stress that makes me lose a bit of sleep is the fact I don't have protection and I touch people's waist. That makes me sleepless at night. Sometimes I worry about it. A common issue is drinking alcohol before doing this work because it can be so hard to deal with. And so one person responds, for example, that everyone in my group has to drink alcohol before they work except for me. And then in terms of how these issues relate specifically to menstrual waste, the women sanitation workers report this kind of problem, which is that their male colleagues will kind of blame them for this problem and say, women are filling up the pits with the pads. I'm stressed because I'm a woman. I'm carrying the burden for both of them. And I have to collect the pads because we're the ones who dump them there. But even the women will stigmatize me for handling pads, even though they're the same ones who placed it there. If they were responsible, they would instead air them out and then burn them later. And then another worker reports issues that they're having with the lagoon. So sometimes this waste is not accepted. For the unregistered workers, they're almost certainly not allowed to enter the Kewasco lagoon with their waste. So that means they're going to be burying this waste or dumping it somewhere. Then that's going to create other potential sort of environmental health issues for the surrounding area. So it's really only the registered workers who are kind of sort of allowed to bring this waste in. And so someone is reporting here that at the lagoon, we have challenges. They don't accept it. And then we just stock them there. And then eventually they have to come back. The sanitation workers have to come back and deal with this kind of like pile of solid waste that has accumulated. So one of the things that they do is to make large piles and burn it. And they're saying, you beg them they beg the kind of security to let them in. And if you get someone on duty, he'll ask you to give him something. So just some points on this part. We can see that the infrastructure is failing the users of these systems. So filling up your pit latrine is not a good thing because it fills up quicker, and that means you need to empty it more. So it's not an ideal disposal system, really, although the system is sort of half working. And then for sanitation workers, it creates this very large challenge of having much heavier and harder waste to deal with that they have to handle more by hand. So we can see that sanitation workers are often looked down on by local decision makers and residents, even though they're playing an essential part of the city's waste infrastructure. So it's really important to think about this challenge, both in terms of the material flows of waste and how we can deal with these plastics and solid waste and the fecal sludge in informal settlements, but also think about the urban power relations between these different groups, in particular marginalized waste workers. And the problem is that they often have much less say in sort of the urban planning processes and how these issues are actually being dealt with, even though they're kind of much more intimately involved with these problems. So actually have a lot of input. So the last thing I wanted to share with you today is actually kind of how to respond to this challenge and one of the methods we've used in terms of a research approach to do that. And this is using different participatory methods with stakeholders to kind of explore their ways of understanding these problems and also how they envision different waste futures. So one of these methods is participatory mapping, and I think this approach is most effective when you have kind of different understandings of the situation to show, because it gives marginalized groups tools that they can document their own spatial knowledge and kind of reclaim some of the narratives around infrastructure issues. And the second one is featuring exercises. So this involves inviting excluded groups, and in this case, sanitation workers, to think about different futures and how they envision this problem to be addressed, kind of shifting from what maybe is the allowed discussions that normally take place. So I just want to show you some of the findings from these exercises, and I think these tools can be used, to deal with different types of challenges, not just this particular case on menstrual waste. But the maps here show different maps created by stakeholder groups. So on the left, you see the sort of what the government actors produced to show, where does menstrual waste go in Kisumu? And so what they're kind of just showing you overall is that the waste is going to the main dump site I mentioned is 40 kilometers outside of the city. So where does menstrual waste go? It's collected and it goes to the solid waste dump outside the city. Those are the pink arrows. There's kind of some other disposal sites mentioned here, but the main emphasis is everything goes to this Kasizi dump site. This is really different from what the sanitation workers developed in terms of their map. And here at the bottom, we have this lagoon, which is the Kiwasco wastewater lagoon. And this is kind of what they're showing with arrows of this waste kind of coming down to the lagoon. So this, and we then did some ground truthing exercises afterwards to look at where some of the sites on these maps and see what was actually happening. So we see, and we can also kind of triangulate this with the survey data, that in fact most waste is going to the lagoon. It's not really being taken to the main dump site, but that's kind of like the narrative that the government is presenting, is that this problem is kind of being handled, it's being taken to the main dump site. So by kind of asking the sanitation workers to show how it works from their perspective, we were able to kind of illustrate this different reality, and that is in fact more representative of the actual challenge and situation. The government actors in this case describe what's happening here in this other map as illegal. So dumping this waste at the lagoon is illegal because no solid waste should be going to the wastewater lagoon. And so these maps show that there is some solid waste systems or disposal happening, but to deal with menstrual waste, there is kind of like an informal but somewhat functioning approach where the solid waste is kind of separated out at the wastewater lagoon, and the users, for them it sort of works, and the sanitation workers try to make it work. And this is similar to other research in the global south that shows that there are these kind of everyday arrangements in urban areas that are blurring boundaries between formal and informal systems. So it's a bit of a gray area where it's a somewhat functioning system, but there are still many challenges. And this is the last approach I wanted to share with you. And this is just about thinking with the sanitation workers about what they envision, how this problem could be addressed. So this is the 3 horizons approach, which starts with the step 1 over here that invites you to think about the challenges you're facing today, like how is the current system under strain, and then think about horizon 3, which is then about what kind of vision you have for the future, what kind of values and norms would be needed to support that preferred future. And then you kind of think about how do you get there from today to this future vision, which is kind of an undetermined point in time. What are some of the innovations or different approaches that might support this ideal future situation that we can see kind of evolving in the present, and it would help us move towards that desired future. So this was just an exercise to help stakeholders think about this problem in a bit more of a creative way. And we also found a similar finding to the maps, which is that stakeholders had different perceptions of what they saw as the kind of solution for this problem. We saw that NGOs, local governments, they're more interested in kind of like an aspirational zero waste future that could bring, could really address these health and environmental risks and essentially make them go away. We saw, in contrast, sanitation workers, this is their livelihoods, dealing with waste. They don't want a zero waste future, and preferred better management of the system today and looking at how it can be improved. So kind of a different perspective of this problem. And so this also shows that not all stakeholders align with maybe what seems like a transformational future in terms of sustainability as well. So just to conclude, from this study, we can see how sanitation workers are absorbing the systemic failures of sanitation and solid waste infrastructure and the inadequacies in these different services. They're essentially they're part of this infrastructure. They're functioning as like a component of this infrastructure, while at the same time being excluded from decision-making and planning spaces on how to address these issues. And in fact, they're often accused of doing illegal practices while having really no other options. So it's important to listen to, their ideas of how things can be improved, things like having better equipment to handle heavier waste, more powerful tools, higher payments for the emptying work, so that this is like something that they can have a good livelihood from, and also legal protections and safety training. These are just some of the things that they propose themselves. And just to conclude, it's clear there's an urgent need to address the gaps and the solid waste, menstrual waste that's falling between the solid waste and the sanitation systems. And this is particularly an issue in informal settlements, to ensure we're protecting the health both of the residents and also the sanitation workers. So I just want to thank everyone who's part of this research and acknowledge them as well. Neville, Aquaro, Collins, Rito, they were part of the USAID project. They're now continuing to work in the sanitation sector in Kenya. Our colleague Panagotis is actually doing some work analyzing pad samples and the chemical contamination. And Samahira and Sarah, who's the PI, have been working on the qualitative work. We're planning an upcoming webinar, just to mention, with Kenyan experts who are going to talk more about how this problem is evolving and being addressed in terms of the policy side. I don't actually have a link yet for this, but if you're interested, just please get in contact with me and I can share it. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much.